Okay, our next speaker is Erica Fries, and Erica is a rangeland ecologist at the University of Nevada in Reno, and she's been working with Dr. Tamsin Stringham to develop and write state and transition models for ecological sites in both Oregon and Nevada. So, welcome, Erica.
So I'm Erica Fries. I'm standing in for Tamsin Stringham today. Tom invited her to come and speak, and she's working on a big grant proposal. It's grant season right now at the university, so you guys get to see my talk, which is a combination of some of the work that I've been working with Dr. Stringham on. So today I'm going to be talking about understanding disturbance response and some of the options with restoration, and really specifically utilizing state and transition models for those purposes. So a quick overview. I'll tell you what an ecological site description is, a quick overview of state and transition models, and then we'll talk a little bit about ecological processes, triggers, feedbacks, at-risk communities, some restoration pathways, and then I'll go through an example at the end. So an ecological site, hopefully some of you are familiar with those, are defined as a distinctive kind of land that differs in its ability to produce the distinctive kind and amount of vegetation, and included kind of in that is climate, landform, soils, plants. So it's all those things combined to make an ecological site. And when we talk about the ecological site description, which is an NRCS product, it includes lots of things. So you have physiographic features, climatic features, soil features, plant communities, uses, and part of that plant community section in the description is the ecological dynamics and the state and transition model. So the ecological dynamics and the state and transition model are just a portion of the ecological site description. For those of you that like some light reading before bedtime, just a list of some useful papers. The 2003 Stringham et al. Paper is kind of the nuts and bolts. The Brisky 2008, you'll see a lot of definitions and what I'm talking about today comes out of that paper. And for those of you that either are lucky enough to work in riparian systems or have water, the 2010 paper with Tamsin and Jeff Rep begins the process of state and transition models for riparian ecosystems. And I've heard word that NRCS is maybe moving forward on that, so hopefully there'll be something out soon. Yeah, Damon says yes. So just to frame the state and transition models a little bit, when I'm talking about these, our spatial scale is just at the ecological site. So specific to that ecological site, they're not, what I'm talking about today is not the overall landscape. Temporal framework, this is really important. We're only talking about our current climate, and there's so much talk today about climate change and what's going to happen, and the ecological sites and the state and transition models are really written for our current climate, so as things start to change, our ecological sites and the models will have to change along with those. And the models describe the ecological dynamics of the ecological site. I'll show you here shortly. A lot of us think about STMs as a box and arrow diagram, and that's a really useful way for us to put it into a visual framework. But it really, all the description that goes with it is what's useful. And state and transition models might sound like a scary concept, but really what they are is a management or a disturbance model. That's how I like to think about it. So it's the what if. So what if there's poor grazing, good grazing, drought, fire? What happens with all of those kinds of disturbances? And then the really key thing that I want you to take home today is that these are process-based models. It is not a species list or species-based. It's process-based. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So when I talk about ecological dynamics, what am I talking about? So that's response to disturbance and different disturbances. So fire, grazing, flood, insects, drought, invasive species are a disturbance. And then, you know, as we all know, none of these things generally occur singularly. They're all interacting together or concurrently happening at the same time. And so that disturbance becomes part of this cycle that's interacting with all these other things. So it's influencing soils, vegetation, maybe we get rain, maybe we don't get rain. And then all those landform type things factor into that also. And just a key point here, something that's really come to mind in the work that I do is that when you're using ecological site descriptions and the state and transition models, is that those ecological dynamics really allow for a repository for historical, local, and scientific knowledge. So as a profession, we have a lot of aging members that have a lot of knowledge, and this is a way for us to get some of that down on paper so that when they retire, the younger ones aren't trying to rewrite the book. And, you know, I think Tom just kind of spoke to that. You know, we've been fighting cheatgrass for 65 years. Let's not reinvent the wheel, but really learn from what we have done and what has and hasn't worked. And these models become a way for us to capture that. So thinking about that knowledge, here's an example from MLRA 24, which is around Winnemucca, Nevada. One of the guys that worked with us on our team developing the models there worked there most of his career. And so his knowledge when we're out in the field really brings to light that fire, you know, we all say fire, but that means a lot of things. So first fire, you might kill your plants, might cause some soil damage, you might increase your invasive weeds a little bit. But in that part of the world, it burns a lot. So the second fire, if you did get anything to establish after the first one, you probably just killed those off. You're going to increase your weeds. And then if you get the third fire, and this specific example, the picture on the right there is 3 fires in 15 years. You know, and then we're moving large amounts of soil, and this might look like there's a lot of veg there, but it's mostly burr buttercup. You know, so it's a plant this big. You can't hold together the world with really short invasive weeds. So when we talk about process-based models, what are we talking about? So process is a rate, an amount per time. And so processes that we're talking about with these models are infiltration rates, nutrient cycling, energy capture, soil development or erosion, and yeah, we can do infiltration rings and look at infiltration rates, but a lot of this other stuff, we have a really hard time directly quantifying those, so we use kind of surrogate things or other things that might be indicators for the processes that are going on. If you've never seen a state and transition model, here's just kind of a blank template, and I'll try not to bore you with the details. Hopefully I won't bore you. So this is just a blank model. This larger box is what we call the state. Within a state you have community phases. The arrows between those are your community phase pathways. You have transitions between states, and then you can kind of think of this space as the threshold. And I'll go through just some quick definitions of what all of these mean. And then the arrows going back to a quote-unquote higher state is what we call restoration pathways. So what is a state? So a suite of plant community phases occurring on similar soils that interact with the environment to produce functional and structural attributes. And this part is really important, a characteristic range of variability. So they don't all look the same. So you might have one ecological site, but when you're looking at that description, there's a range of variability in the amount of plants that occur. And I think sometimes we no pun intended here, we kind of box ourselves into what exactly that means without considering that complete range of variation. And then this is maintained through self-repair mechanisms. So again, these are our community phases within this larger state. And those of you that are familiar with succession, you can kind of think of those as your serial stages, more linear succession type things. And then these community phase pathways are really your ecological dynamics. So what takes you from a late cereal sagebrush steppe to a native perennial grass-dominated community? Well, this arrow here is generally fire. So all of the descriptions of these arrows are what's going on to make those plant communities occur on the landscape. A transition in the box and arrow diagram is the arrows between states. So this is a trajectory of change away from the current stable state, generally triggered by some kind of disturbance or event. And the key point here is that it degrades the site beyond the point of self-repair. So once we go from, and this is not a great example, but from state 1 to state 2, you can't just turn around and go back. You can't put a little water on it. You can't take the cows off and think that it will just go back to looking like a late cereal sagebrush steppe. It's not how it works. And so what is a threshold? So a threshold, you can think of those state boundaries, so the yellow lines here, and this is really dealing with ecosystem resilience. So once we've crossed a threshold, we've exceeded the resilience at that point to self-repair. And the key here is it's irreversible without inputs of energy. So like I just said, you can't just add a little rain, take the cows off, kill the insects, and expect it to go back. So a way you can think about that, so resilience is the extent of modification required to transform an ecosystem to an alternative state. So going from state 1 to state 2. A good way to think about this is kind of a rubber band. So they're stretchy. So how far can you stretch that rubber band before it can go back? And the threshold defines the limits of resilience. So once you snap that rubber band, it's pretty hard to make it look like a rubber band again. If you're more of the mechanical type, you can think of an O-ring if a rubber band doesn't do it for you. So once we've snapped that rubber band, now what? We've crossed the threshold, we're in a different state. And so then we're talking about restoration pathways. And this is establishment of a pre-threshold state, hopefully something better, following active restoration of, and I hate the terminology here, but we'll talk a little bit more about these. So negative feedback mechanisms, but the negative mechanisms are good things, the positive ones are bad things, so just think of those differently in your head. And important here is that the probability of your success declines the longer you get from when that threshold was crossed. So the sooner you can fix things, the better. I think we can probably all agree there. So feedback mechanisms are processes that enhance or decrease ecosystem resilience. And when we think about a switch, it's the point from when those feedback mechanisms shift from negative to positive and exceed the resilience limits for that site. And these are typically associated with trigger events or successful rehabilitation of your processes. So we'll talk a little, we'll give some examples here in just a second. So feedback mechanisms, in the next several slides you'll see an indicator section and an assessment side. So the indicator is an indicator of state vulnerability to crossing a threshold. So what are the things we're looking at here? So an indicator might be you have soil erosion or nutrient loss. Well, what do I use to determine that? Well, you can look at soil loss, rills, pedestals. I think here, a lot of this is a little bud sage plant. This is the lens of a camera cap. I think we can all agree that obviously we've had some soil loss because we can see the roots exposed of that plant. Something we can just think about without having to say, I was out there measuring soil blow away or wash away. Soil surface degradation, you can look at aggregate stability, organic matter, microtopography, nutrient redistribution. Do we have desert pavement? Do we have coppice dunes forming under shrubs where our soils are moving around on the landscape? And then bare soil is obviously an indicator. So are the areas getting bigger? Are they getting smaller? Are they becoming more connected? Feedback mechanisms related to function. So above ground productivity, biomass, it's easy to clip and estimate biomass. Are we going up or down? Carbon and nitrogen pools, you can look at biomass, soil organic matter. Infiltration rates, we can directly measure rates, but a lot of us don't have time nor the desire to go out there and run infiltration rings. So what are things we can use kind of as a surrogate for that? And plant and liver cover, slope, soil texture. Here in the background, this is a debris jam. This used to be a stream, intermittent obviously. And what has happened here is there was a fire upstream, burned off all of our vegetative material. They got a big thunderstorm, and now obviously our infiltration rates have been compromised, and all that stuff has been washed downhill. When we're thinking about the plant community, obviously invasive species are something, we can measure density, rate of spread, are they dominant? The picture in the background, obviously cheatgrass is dominating this site. Find fuel loads, plant reproductive potential, species and functional group loss. Have we lost a whole functional group? Have we lost all of our shrubs? Have we lost all of our trees? So those are things you can think about when you're trying to think through the processes that are either degraded or might show some indication that maybe we're close to crossing a threshold. So the other term that's kind of new in state transition models is triggers. And there's been a lot of talk about gun laws lately, so we're not talking about these kinds of triggers. But triggers are events that initiate thresholds by contributing to the immediate loss of ecosystem resilience. So you can think of a lot of rain, we get a huge flash flood, that's a trigger. Again, these indicators state vulnerability to crossing a threshold. So severe drought, what can we use? Well, weather records, we can look at plant cover, density, and mortality. In addition to our starving cows. Indicators of modified fire regimes. This is a big one that a lot of us deal with. You can look at land use history, woody plant density. We have more woody plants than we used to. Fuel loads, species composition. So these are all tools you can use to assess those indicators. Another one is episodic events, and I think we tend to kind of forget about these sometimes. So you can look at extreme weather patterns, change in species composition and cover. I don't know that you can see it very well in this picture, but right behind the box there's kind of a greener sagebrush. This is out on the Owyhee Desert last summer, and as far as the eye can see, you've had a roga moth affecting the sagebrush. This is huge, and it's not something we see to this kind of extent every year. So I think sometimes we tend to forget that we can have these really large episodic events that impact thousands of acres. It's not fire, it's not something that burned, but these moths are having a big impact, and we'll see long term how that's affecting these systems. So resilience-based thinking, what exactly does that mean? So understanding that what we see is created by the inherent capability of the site and the functional capacity of those ecological processes. And then to kind of couple back to that, the sensitivity of those processes to disturbance is how resilient your site is. Kind of some newer terminology for state and transition models is thinking about at-risk community phases. So what is that community phase within a state? So the large box, thinking about the little boxes. What is that community phase that's most vulnerable to crossing a threshold? So the site or the community phase that could be most affected by drought or fire and go to something worse. And you know, a question we get a lot is, well, how do you know when you're at risk? And that's generally the million-dollar question. It's not a number. A lot of us make it really easy if we could just put numbers on everything and say, well, you've got 20% cover of cheatgrass, therefore you're at an at-risk community phase. And those of you that are familiar with rangeland ecologists, probably one of our favorite terms is it depends. And I don't think we say that to just cop out of giving an answer, but it really does depend, and it depends on all of those other factors interacting together as to what exactly your response is going to be, and are you really at risk or not. So it's not a number, it's not a species list, but what I'd like to get across here is that it's really more about having that discussion, the discussion of what if it burns, what if we get insects, or what if we don't get any rain this year, or what if the cows get in and we graze it and we weren't supposed to? Or if we are thinking about treating it, we want to do something, if we put herbicide or we chop down trees, what is going to happen? So really it's having that discussion, and whether you come to the right answer might not really matter as long as you're thinking through all of those processes and the actions that you may or may not want to do. So this discussion of ecological process, function, and are we crossing a threshold, how we cross the threshold, does it really matter? And yeah, it does, but we don't always get the answer right. And hopefully you have more than just yourself to talk it through with. So some tools we can use to help identify an at-risk phase. Some of you are probably familiar with rangeland health and the indicators of rangeland health. So they're a good way to kind of frame a discussion with yourself and your people to kind of talk through that. So are we having a change in functional structural groups? Do we have increased bare ground? Do we have decreased soil surface stability or increased water flow paths? There's all these things that we can kind of think about that are indicators to, are we at risk? Maybe we've crossed the threshold. And thinking about all of those things might help you come to the right answer. And then the other question is, well, at risk to what? Are we at risk of burning and then going to a cheatgrass-dominated rangeland? Are we at risk of a drought and losing our perennial bunch grasses? So thinking about those trigger events and those feedback mechanisms, and then it's always good to check and see if these things have happened. And a lot of times, hopefully, if we have some of that historical knowledge,